The year was 1913. All of New York City looked to the sky in sheer awe. At the White House, President Woodrow Wilson pressed a ceremonial golden button, and instantly, 80,000 lights bulbs flickered to life, transforming the tallest building in the world into a massive pillar of fire and crystal, tearing through the darkness of the Manhattan night. Frank Winfield Woolworth had achieved the unthinkable. Through sheer force of will and a revolutionary idea, he erected this cathedral of commerce not with gold bars or oil, but with the nickels and dimes of the poor. From a penniless farm boy who began his journey with a mere $300 borrowed from a store that failed within 2 weeks, Woolworth now commanded the largest retail chain on the planet, but looked deeper into the shadows behind that brilliant glow. At the opulent Winfield Hall estate, a titan of commerce was seen with a vacant stare, clad in a meticulously tailored military uniform once belonging to Napoleon Bonaparte. Complete with a sharply pointed bicorn hat, he paced the polished marble corridors in haunting solitude. By night, he slept in a reproduction of the French emperor's bed. By day, he immersed himself in esoteric volumes of Egyptian mythology and arcane occult rituals, a pathological fixation of a man who had conquered the world but lost himself in the process. The most painful paradox lay at the farthest reaches of this sprawling house. Behind a door kept resolutely closed, guarded by a nurse who stood as a silent sentinel to a private tragedy, his wife, Jenny, was languishing. She sat in a stark, plain room, furnished only with a single bed and a rocking chair, her mind having retreated from reality over a year prior. Woolworth, consumed by his empire and his own internal battles, rarely visited. He concluded this triumphant phase of his life with a palatial marble residence. Yet the cost was a family whose bonds his vast fortune was systematically dismantling. To understand the man in the Napoleon hat and the tower built of dimes, one must travel back to the cold, hard dirt where the dream first struggled to breathe. The farm stretched across 11 miles south of Watertown, nestled within the fertile, if unforgiving, embrace of Jefferson County, New York. It was, by any measure, far from a prosperous endeavor. The stubborn soil of Rodman yielded meager harvests, primarily potatoes, and little else of significant value. Mortgage payments, however, arrived with an unwavering regularity that far outpaced the uncertain bounty of the land. John Hubble Woolworth, a man hardened by the recent crucible of the Civil War, had returned home to marry Fanny McBreer in 1851. Their first son, Frank Winfield, made his appearance on April 13th, 1852. 4 years later, a second boy, Charles Sumner, followed. The name chosen for the younger brother was no idle fancy. Charles Sumner was a formidable Massachusetts senator, a fiery orator, and an unwavering abolitionist. The Woolworths, devout Methodists with deep-rooted Union sympathies, had selected the name with deliberate intent, imbuing their son with the weight of their convictions. From a tender age, the boys were expected to contribute to the household. Mornings before school meant the arduous task of milking cows in the dim light of dawn. Evenings stretched into the fading twilight, spent bent over rows of earth, meticulously picking potatoes by hand. Frank despised every grueling minute of it. He was by all accounts a decent student, intellectually curious, and well-liked by his teachers. But within the insular community of Rodman, no one harbored expectations for him beyond the familiar path of a farmer, destined to succeed his father as his father had succeeded his own. Yet Frank harbored different dreams, seeds of ambition sown early. At the remarkably young age of 4, he startled his parents with a definitive declaration. He intended to become a peddler, just like the colorful, transient salesmen who occasionally traversed the county roads, bringing with them a whiff of the wider world. He and Charles, during their precious free hours, would immerse themselves in elaborate games of store. Frank, ever the ringleader, would meticulously arrange various household items on a makeshift counter, engaging his younger brother in negotiations over prices with a gravity that simultaneously amused and baffled the adults privy to their play. The family's humble abode was, by historical coincidence, situated near the dilapidated remains of a property once linked to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother. Joseph had spent years in exile in the United States after his deposition as King of Spain. According to later accounts from Frank's own life, the boys were utterly captivated by the legends and stories woven into the very fabric of that place. Tales of distant empires, of kingdoms conquered and lost, and of a general who had bent the entire continent of Europe to his formidable will. For a boy condemned to the monotonous labor of pulling potatoes from cold, unforgiving dirt, the echoes of Bonaparte represented everything that Rodman, with its limited horizons, was not. It was a potent fuel for a restless spirit. Frank, unable to bear the confines of farm life any longer, left school at 16 to work on the farm full-time, his mother, Fanny, observing the rising tide of restlessness within him. With characteristic resolve, she intervened, recognizing a spark in her son that deserved more. She personally financed his attendance at a bookkeeping course at a business school in Watertown, lending him money from her own family's meager savings. After each exhausting day on the farm, Frank would hitch the family pony to their trap and make the journey into town for his evening classes, a daily pilgrimage towards a different future. He diligently absorbed the principles of commerce, but his education extended far beyond the classroom walls. He studied the shop windows along Watertown's bustling main streets with an even more meticulous gaze. These vibrant storefronts, with their artful displays and promise of goods, planted a powerful idea within him, an instinct that the classroom teachings only served to reinforce. For a brief period, he dreamed of becoming a train driver, watching the powerful locomotives thunder through Watertown, imagining a life of constant movement, vast distances, and freedom. But he talked himself out of it, a pragmatism that would define his future kicking in. A merchant, he concluded, was a far more realistic aspiration. From that moment, every shop he passed was scrutinized with the keen, discerning eye of someone who fully intended to own one. But while his mind was busy calculating profits and displays, his dignity was about to be tested by the very industry he so admired. Then came the moment, a memory so profound that decades later he would still recount it as utterly formative. Frank and his brother Charles, pooling their meager resources, managed to scrape together 50 cents in loose change to buy their mother a birthday present. They walked into a grand department store in Watertown, a temple of commerce, and found a beautiful silk scarf, a luxury beyond their usual reach. As they brought their handful of coins to the counter, the clerks, instead of assisting, gathered around. They pointed, whispered, and then openly laughed. The boys, young and vulnerable, were mercilessly mocked for attempting to pay in a pile of nickels and pennies. One particularly sneering salesman remarked that perhaps next year they would manage to scrape together enough for the matching gloves. Frank, utterly humiliated, retreated. He purchased a similar scarf at a different, less grand shop where the staff, at least, were polite. But the burning sting of humiliation did not dissipate. Walking home with his younger brother, his spirit still smarting, he made a declaration that, knowing the trajectory of his future, sounds less like a childhood boast and more like an unequivocal declaration of war. He told Charles, his voice perhaps trembling with suppressed rage, that one day, 50 cents would be enough to buy not 1, but 5 or even 10 items, and every single customer, regardless of how they paid, would be treated with unwavering respect. It would take him another decade to fully act upon this vow, but the boy from the potato farm had, in that moment, discovered something far more potent and enduring than mere ambition. He had found a grievance, and Frank Woolworth, as history would dramatically prove, was not the kind of person who ever let a grievance go. In the spring of 1873, Fanny, ever his champion, finally persuaded her husband to release Frank from the relentless demands of the farm for a period of 6 months. Let him try, she argued with conviction. Let him see if he could make something of himself in town. John, pragmatic and perhaps a little resigned, agreed, albeit reluctantly. Frank packed his sparse belongings, a suitcase filled more with resolve than possessions, and headed for Watertown. He was 20 years old, possessing no discernible connections, no relevant experience, and, as would soon become apparent, no particular natural talent for selling anything. What he did possess, however, was a chip on his shoulder the size of Jefferson County. It would prove to be more than enough. Watertown was not the welcoming land of opportunity Frank had imagined, but a battlefield of cold counters and judging eyes. Frank Woolworth strode into Augsbury and Moore's dry goods store in the spring of 1873, a crisp bookkeeping certificate clutched in one hand and a bold proposition on his lips. He offered to work for nothing, for 3 arduous months, completely without wages, in exchange for the invaluable opportunity to learn the trade from the inside. Morgan Augsbury, the senior partner, eyed the young man from the country with a discerning, critical gaze. He noted the absence of a proper tie, the lack of polished manners suitable for engaging customers across a counter. He was not impressed, and certainly not interested. However, William Moore, the junior partner, possessed a more adventurous spirit, and was intrigued by the audacious nerve of the offer. He agreed to take a chance. If Frank proved himself useful by the 4th month, a small salary would indeed follow. He did not, however, prove useful in the way anyone had anticipated. They initially assigned him to the most mundane and back-breaking tasks, sweeping the dusty floors, making deliveries that crisscrossed Watertown, and tirelessly restocking shelves. When, after weeks of observation, they finally allowed him to serve customers, the results were, frankly, agonizing. Frank froze. His tongue tied, he stumbled over his sales pitch, his voice cracking with nerves. He struggled to engage, to persuade, to perform the basic rituals of retail sales. The other staff members, witnessing his repeated failures, began to treat him as a palpable liability, a drag on their collective efforts. Augsbury, in private conversations, began to seriously question whether Moore had made a costly error in judgment. But Frank possessed one singular, undeniable talent that none of his colleagues behind the counter could match, let alone surpass. He could dress a window. Given full control of the vital front display, a space often neglected or haphazardly arranged, he began to transform it. He meticulously grouped merchandise not by function, but by harmonious color and striking shape. He stacked items at innovative, eye-catching angles, creating an illusion of abundance and artistry. The storefront, once a mere facade, became a magnet, a dynamic visual narrative that literally pulled people off the sidewalk and through the shop's front door. Augsbury noticed. Moore noticed. Most importantly, the customers noticed. Within a matter of months, the window display, once an ancillary task, became Frank's permanent, indispensable assignment. It was while meticulously observing those captivated customers, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes scanning the artfully arranged goods, that a profound instinct began to solidify within him. The standard practice in dry goods stores of that era was a rigid, almost ceremonial affair. A clerk stood as an intermediary, a gatekeeper, between the desired merchandise and the eager buyer. A customer would describe their need or wish. The clerk would then retrieve the item, often from behind a counter or locked cabinet, announce a price, and an often lengthy, tiresome negotiation would invariably ensue. Nothing displayed bore a fixed price tag. Nothing was directly within a customer's reach, available for personal inspection. The entire system was predicated upon the skill, personality, and often the intimidating authority of the person behind the counter. Frank, who was demonstrably terrible at being that person, began to perceive the glaring flaw. What if, he mused, the goods were placed directly where people could touch them, examine them without asking permission? What if every single item already had a price, clear and non-negotiable, openly attached? What if the vibrant, self-explanatory display did the primary selling, and the clerk merely served as a facilitator, simply handling the money? He could not have articulated these revolutionary concepts in precise business terms then, but the seed of a completely new retail paradigm was firmly planted in the fertile ground of his mind. Woolworth's true insight was not just in pricing, but in human psychology. By bringing goods out from behind locked cabinets, he handed the consumer a rare gift: the power of touch and the autonomy of choice. In an era where shopping was a judgmental ritual of negotiation, the fixed price was a democratic equalizer, removing the fear of being cheated and inviting the poor to browse with dignity. He remained at Moore's establishment for 6 challenging years. His wages, meager at first, gradually crept up to $10 a week, only to be cruelly cut back to $8 after a particularly poor stretch of business. The relentless grind of daily retail, as it existed then, drove him to such a state of physical and mental exhaustion at one point that he utterly collapsed, forcing him to spend 6 months convalescing at home. He was clearly not built for the conventional, demanding rhythm of the existing retail model. Yet, even during his recovery, his mind was tirelessly assembling a profoundly different model, a revolutionary system that he believed would entirely replace the outdated, inefficient practices of his time. But while Frank focused on the future of commerce, he found his present anchor in a young seamstress who saw the man behind the relentless ambition. Jenny Kitten, a steadying presence, entered his life somewhere in the midst of those formative, difficult years. She had been born in Picton, a small, unassuming town in Ontario, Canada, and worked as a skilled seamstress in the very same shop. Where Frank was a whirlwind of restless energy and volatile ambition, Jenny was calm, grounded, and eminently practical. Where he dreamed in vast, often impractical arcs of future glory, she dealt in the tangible realities of what was real and what was immediately needed. They married on June 11, 1876, in what was, by all accounts from those who knew them, a genuine love match, built on mutual respect and affection. Jenny would later confide in close friends that those early years were, paradoxically, the best. Not because of any material wealth they possessed, for they had none, but because of how much of Frank, the man, she got to keep. When there was no nascent empire to tirelessly run, he came home to her at night. When there was no burgeoning fortune to meticulously manage, they sat together, simply present with each other. She once famously said she had been happier when they did not have a dime. By the time anyone thought to commit her poignant words to writing, her mind, like that of his mother, had sadly receded, and she was no longer able to articulate much of anything at all. Frank's final transformative lesson at Moore's store came from an unexpected source: a surplus clearance sale. Leftover, slow-moving stock was hastily piled onto a designated table, each item conspicuously priced at 5 cents. The goods, once ignored behind glass cases and subject to negotiation, sold with astonishing speed. Customers who would never have given them a second glance eagerly grabbed items when the price was plainly visible and the merchandise was physically within their reach. While Frank Woolworth is often celebrated as the father of the 5 and dime, he didn't actually invent the 5-cent concept. The 5-cent counter craze already existed, and Frank himself set up his first 5-cent table while clerking for his former boss, William Moore. Woolworth's true genius was taking that single counter and transforming it into an independent, mass-market retail empire. The 5-cent table unequivocally proved what his innovative front window displays had already strongly suggested. People would buy almost anything if the price was clear, the access was easy and direct, and, crucially, the entire shopping experience did not make them feel small or inferior. He now possessed the core concept, the blueprint for a revolution. He just needed someone, anyone, to lend him the money to make it a reality. The blueprint was finished, but in the world of retail, an idea without inventory is just a ghost. Frank didn't need a miracle. He needed a chance. William Moore, demonstrating a continued faith in his eccentric protege, advanced Frank not cash, but $300 worth of merchandise. This was stock, not liquid capital, an inventory of thimbles, combs, button hooks, harmonicas, baby bibs, bars of soap, pencils, and napkins. It was precisely the kind of small, inexpensive items that typically cluttered the dusty, overlooked back shelves of every dry goods operation across the bustling Northeast. Moore, recognizing the potential, also released Frank from his duties at the Watertown shop, giving him the freedom to seek out his own retail location. Frank chose Utica, New York, a seemingly promising city. On February 22, 1879, Frank Woolworth proudly opened the doors of his very first independent venture, Woolworth's great 5-cent store on Bleecker Street. The space itself was modest, measuring roughly 13 feet by 20 feet. Every single item inside was, as advertised, priced at a nickel. The initial days were surprisingly promising. Curious customers flocked in, drawn by the novelty. They picked up items, turned them over in their hands, marveling at the simplicity and transparency of the offering. And they bought. The sheer convenience of walking into a place where every price was known beforehand, and nothing required the intimidating ritual of negotiation, proved to be an irresistible draw. However, the initial novelty, potent as it was, began to fade. The chosen location on Bleecker Street was, regrettably, poor. Foot traffic, once bustling, thinned out dramatically. Within a mere few weeks, the ambitious operation was definitively finished. Frank, a man of his word, promptly paid more back what he owed, packed up the distinctive sign bearing his name, and left Utica. He did not, however, abandon the idea itself. What had failed in Utica, Frank remained absolutely certain, was the address, not the revolutionary principle. A perceptive friend, understanding Frank's unwavering conviction, suggested Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This city, deep in the heart of Pennsylvania Dutch country, was a place where thrift was not merely a practicality but a deeply ingrained cultural value, and a 5-cent bargain might resonate in a profoundly different way. Frank, undeterred by his recent failure, hauled the same familiar sign across state lines. On June 21, 1879, he triumphantly reopened his store on North Queen Street in Lancaster. The first day's sales amounted to an astonishing $127.65. By the standards of a fledgling, one-man operation selling nickel merchandise, this figure was nothing short of extraordinary. Within a few weeks, buoyed by this undeniable success, Frank made a pivotal decision that would define the entire trajectory of his burgeoning career. He introduced a second tier of goods, priced at a dime. This expanded range meant he could now carry items that possessed genuine household utility, moving beyond mere novelties and trinkets. Customers who initially came in for a 5-cent comb often left with a 10-cent set of napkins, or a practical kitchen utensil. The average transaction value, a crucial metric, effectively doubled. Lancaster held. The store not only survived but turned a consistent profit. Emboldened, Frank brought in his younger brother Charles to manage a second location in Harrisburg. That venture, unfortunately, struggled with the difficulties of a demanding landlord and eventually closed its doors. A third attempt, in York, Pennsylvania, lasted only a few months before it too folded. The pattern was brutal and unforgiving. For every location that managed to thrive and hold its own, another inevitably failed. Frank, however, learned invaluable lessons from each setback. He learned to read a town quickly, to accurately identify patterns of foot traffic, and to discern the critical difference between a bustling main street and a seemingly similar side street that merely looked like a main street but lacked its essential commercial pulse. But as the map of his ambitions grew, Frank realized that a revolutionary system still required reliable hands to turn the gears. What he also learned, with a clarity forged in the fires of trial and error, was that he could not possibly do it alone. Each new location required a dedicated, capable manager, and Frank soon discovered that the most effective managers were those who possessed a deeply personal stake in the outcome of their individual stores. He began systematically recruiting partners from his existing trusted circle, former colleagues from Moore's shop who understood his methods, reliable family members who grasped the demanding nature of the work, and ambitious men who were willing to invest their own meager savings alongside his merchandise, sharing both the risks and the eventual profits. Every new opening thus became a small, localized partnership, and every successful partner, in turn, became a vital node in a rapidly expanding commercial network. The heart of American commerce beat in the salt air of the New York docks, and Frank knew his empire could no longer be governed from the sidelines of Pennsylvania. The strategic move to Brooklyn came in 1886, a decisive pivot in Frank Woolworth's escalating ambition. He understood that to effectively manage and expand his rapidly multiplying empire, he needed to be physically closer to the myriad wholesale suppliers clustered around New York's bustling commercial waterfront. More importantly, he needed a central office, a command center from which to orchestrate an enterprise that was quickly becoming far too extensive and intricate for a single man to oversee effectively through the slow, cumbersome methods of letter and rail alone. He secured rented space on Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan, establishing his operational headquarters. From this nerve center, he began to dispatch daily, detailed letters to every single manager across his burgeoning chain. These letters were nothing short of extraordinary in their meticulousness, detailed, incredibly specific, and relentlessly demanding. They meticulously outlined which items were selling briskly and which were languishing on shelves, precisely how the all-important window displays should be arranged, and even the optimal configuration of the sales counters within each store. He literally prescribed the layout of every single location, down to the exact placement of individual items on specific tables, and he expected, indeed demanded, absolute compliance. Managers who performed well received effusive praise and welcome bonuses, tangible rewards for their loyalty and efficacy. Those who did not, however, received a far more unwelcome visit from Frank himself, who had developed a rather ingenious and subtly intimidating habit of walking into his own outlets unannounced, discreetly pocketing pieces of merchandise to gauge whether the staff noticed. Those alert employees who caught him in the act were sometimes unexpectedly rewarded for their vigilance. Those who did not, however, received a frank, often blistering conversation they decidedly preferred not to repeat. But Frank knew that controlling the behavior of his staff was only half the battle. The true profit lay in controlling the very source of the products they sold. Yet, the true, game-changing breakthrough during those foundational years on Chambers Street was not purely organizational. It was a radical shift in the very system of supply. Frank had, up until this point, been buying all his stock through traditional wholesalers, absorbing their inherent markup, and watching his profit margin steadily compress as his chain grew. When he made the strategic decision to begin stocking candy, a relatively new and popular retail item, he boldly bypassed the middlemen entirely. He went directly to the manufacturers, purchasing vast quantities of sweets straight from the source. The savings were immediate and profoundly substantial. The manufacturers, in turn, were more than willing to offer significant price reductions for a buyer like Woolworth who could guarantee immense volume across dozens of locations. Frank, recognizing the power of this direct sourcing model, quickly applied the same approach to other product lines. Within a few years, he was directly sourcing goods from factories spanning the United States and even Europe, often committing to buying an entire production run at a specially negotiated, highly favorable rate. Perhaps the most legendary example of this direct sourcing strategy involved a holiday tradition we now take for granted. Back in the autumn of 1880, while his Lancaster store was gaining momentum, a German traveling salesman approached Woolworth with a box of fragile, hand-blown glass Christmas tree ornaments. Frank was famously skeptical, scoffing, "What purpose do they serve? They're literally useless." But his merchant instincts prevailed, and he agreed to take a single box of 144 ornaments strictly on a sale or return basis. Within an hour of hitting the counter, every single bauble was gone. Realizing he had stumbled upon a cultural goldmine, Woolworth didn't just reorder from the salesman. The following year, he traveled directly to Lauscha, Germany, the birthplace of glass blowing, to order a staggering 100,000 sets. By cutting out the middlemen and pricing them at just pennies, Woolworth transformed glass ornaments from an expensive luxury for the elite into a staple for every American household. Over the coming decades, his empire would sell over 500 million of these glittering baubles, literally shaping the visual aesthetic of the modern American Christmas. This was the decisive shift that utterly transformed the simple 5 and 10 from a clever retail concept into a formidable industrial operation. Volume purchasing afforded Frank unprecedented leverage that no individual shopkeeper, however shrewd, could possibly match. This burgeoning power also attracted the keen attention of the very men he had trained. The partner managers who had opened successful locations on Frank's behalf during the 1880s had absorbed his innovative methods exceptionally well. Several had grown ambitious enough to strike out on their own, launching independent chains that brazenly utilized the very same format, the identical pricing structure, and even the instantly recognizable visual identity of the Woolworth stores. Rather than engage them in a costly, destructive war of attrition, Frank, with characteristic ingenuity, did something utterly counterintuitive. He organized them. This remarkable arrangement became famously known as the Friendly Rival Syndicate. Within this unique syndicate, each chain operated under its founder's name, developed its own strategic approach, and competed vigorously with the others for prime retail territory. However, their collective buying power was pooled and channeled through Frank's central purchasing office, giving them all the benefit of his massive volume discounts. They openly shared crucial information on what sold best, what didn't, and carried much of the same core merchandise. From the outside, these rival stores looked strikingly alike: the distinctive red facades, the inviting open counters, the promise of fixed, low prices. Internally, however, they remained distinct, separate businesses, run by men who, almost without exception, owed their humble beginnings to the same dry goods operation in Watertown. The key figures within this syndicate were, unsurprisingly, Frank's own people, a tightly knit network of family and trusted associates. His cousin, Seymour H. Knox, had meticulously built a robust chain of over 100 outlets. Fred Morgan Kirby, who had partnered with Charles Woolworth on a remarkably successful operation in Wilkes Barre way back in 1884, now controlled 84 more. Earl Perry Charlton efficiently ran 48 stores, strategically concentrated in Canada and the western states. And Charles Woolworth himself, Frank's quieter, more introspective brother, managed 14. Frank's own chain, the largest and most dominant, operated a formidable 319 locations. The family network, however, ran even deeper than the founders themselves. Jenny's sister, Mary Kitten, became what was reportedly the first woman to ever manage a Woolworth outlet, capably overseeing the branch in Poughkeepsie before earning a promotion to run a flagship location in the heart of New York City. Jenny's brothers also managed successful branches in Connecticut. The entire operation was, in the most literal sense, a family enterprise, and loyalty, deeply ingrained, was both unequivocally expected and generously rewarded. By 1889, a mere decade after the ignominious Utica failure, Frank W. Woolworth boasted 12 profitable locations strategically scattered across Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. His sales had surged by an incredible 240%, proving that the 5 and 10 format could succeed in both small towns and bustling cities. The distinctive red storefront, with its inviting open counters and clear pricing, had become an instantly recognizable beacon of affordable goods. By 1900, this nascent chain, operating through the friendly rival Syndicate as a unified if decentralized force, had mushroomed to 59 outlets. Together, they dominated the American market for low-priced goods, generating an astonishing annual revenue exceeding $5 million, roughly $155 million in today's money. Frank, the young man who once couldn't sell a bolt of cloth, had built a meticulously engineered machine that moved merchandise by removing every barrier between the product and the customer. He never forgot those who helped him build this machine. When he eventually took the company public, he remembered his earliest benefactor, William Moore, bestowing upon him a grateful payment of $500,000. Yet, even with this dominance, Frank was restless. He was still buying through a labyrinth of wholesalers and watching middlemen shrink his margins. The next step would require a different kind of ambition. Not merely more locations, but more profound, centralized control. However, despite its immense success, this unique structure inherently possessed a fundamental weakness. 5 independent chains, despite their shared purpose, still meant 5 separate corporate entities, each potentially vulnerable to an acquisition bid by an aggressive outsider. In 1905, Frank, ever the strategic visionary, took preemptive action. He incorporated his own chain as F.W. Woolworth and Company, selling shares not to the general public, but exclusively to his most trusted managers and loyal family members. It was a shrewd, defensive maneuver. In a candid letter to his managers, he wrote with apparent, though perhaps feigned, reluctance that modern methods must be pursued. The other syndicate members, recognizing the wisdom and necessity of his move, followed suit, incorporating their own chains over the next few years. The final, monumental step came on November 12, 1911. Fearing the rise of aggressive new competitors and hostile takeovers, Frank realized the fragmented friendly rival syndicate had to evolve. Through sheer force of will and persuasive logic, he convinced all 4 of his key rivals, his cousin Knox and partners Kirby, Charlton, and his brother Charles, to merge their formidable operations into a single, invincible corporate behemoth under the now iconic Woolworth name. This unprecedented $65 million merger consolidated an astonishing 596 locations across the United States and Canada. Frank, naturally, became the president. But more importantly, this masterstroke of corporate strategy instantly transformed all of the syndicate founders into multimillionaires, paving the way for a wildly successful public stock offering. It was, at the time, the single largest retail consolidation in American history. The farm boy from Rodman, who once pulled potatoes from cold dirt, now controlled a vast commercial empire that stretched triumphantly from the Atlantic seaboard to the rugged Rocky Mountains. He had achieved this extraordinary feat without ever taking a single bank loan in its initial stages, and, ironically, without ever truly learning how to personally sell a customer a yard of fabric. He had, however, masterfully learned how to build something far more powerful, a self-sustaining system that did the selling for him. And with the massive financial firepower from this merger, he was now about to unequivocally prove this audacious concept, not just in commerce, but in enduring steel and stone. Even as the complex negotiations for the 1911 merger were consuming his days, Frank's vision had already shifted toward a more permanent monument. In 1910, with the discreet precision that marked his most ambitious endeavors, Frank Woolworth began quietly acquiring properties along the storied thoroughfares of Broadway and Barclay Street in Lower Manhattan. He employed a trusted real estate agent named Edward Hogan to handle the intricate purchases, ensuring that not a soul outside his immediate, tight-knit circle was privy to his true intentions. By April of that year, he had achieved his goal, owning the entire city block. The chosen site was strategically positioned directly opposite City Hall Park, one of the precious few open spaces in the densely packed canyons of Lower Manhattan where a truly tall structure could ascend, unencumbered, and be majestically viewed from a distance, rather than being swallowed by the relentless tide of surrounding buildings. His initial idea was, surprisingly, quite modest by the colossal standards of what ultimately materialized. A respectable commercial office building, perhaps 12 to 16 stories high, merely large enough to comfortably house the burgeoning Woolworth Company headquarters and generate a steady rental income from tenants. But modesty, for a man like Frank Woolworth, was a fleeting concept. The architectural world had recently been captivated by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower, which had grandly risen to a staggering 700 feet on Madison Square, boldly claiming the coveted title of the world's tallest structure. Frank, his competitive spirit irrevocably ignited, looked at that towering monument. Then he looked at his architect's comparatively humble drawings, and the numbers in his mind began an inexorable climb. He had wisely hired Cass Gilbert, a Minnesota-born architect who had honed his craft at the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology and worked for the esteemed New York firm of McKim, Mead, and White before establishing his own acclaimed practice. Gilbert had already forged a national reputation for designing magnificent civic buildings, including the majestic Minnesota State Capitol, and possessed an innate understanding of how to imbue a structure with a profound sense of importance and permanence. Woolworth, demanding nothing less than the extraordinary, dispatched Gilbert to London with specific instructions. He was to meticulously study the Houses of Parliament and the Victoria Tower, and then return with a design that carried the same profound weight, the same imposing grandeur. Gilbert, true to his formidable talent, delivered. His initial design rapidly grew from a modest 20 stories to a commanding 40, and then steadily higher still. By the time Woolworth, relentlessly pushing the boundaries of architectural ambition, had finished, the final plans called for a breathtaking 60 stories, soaring to an awe-inspiring height of 792 feet. Every single vertical line in the building's intricately detailed facade would purposefully draw the eye upward, an undeniable visual ascent. The exterior would be clad in gleaming cream-colored architectural terracotta, adorned with meticulously crafted Gothic ornaments, scaled large enough to be clearly read and appreciated from street level below. Majestic finials, soaring arches, and grotesque gargoyles would subtly reference the medieval cathedrals of Europe, imbuing the modern edifice with a sense of ancient history and timeless grandeur. The building would, by design, appear as though it belonged to an older, more magnificent civilization, while its revolutionary skeletal structure was, unequivocally, pure 20th century engineering ingenuity. That colossal skeleton required an unprecedented 69 pneumatic caissons, driven with immense force 100 to 120 feet deep through the challenging Manhattan clay and sand layers, until they finally reached the solid bedrock below. The steel frame, a marvel of modern construction, rose with astonishing speed. Workers triumphantly topped out the structure on July 1, 1912, a remarkable 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Frank, ever the meticulous overseer, personally watched every stage of the construction, immersing himself in minute details that most clients would have readily left to their architects. He adamantly insisted on the highest possible specification materials. He demanded exquisite marble for the grand lobby, intricate mosaics for the soaring vaulted ceilings, and vibrantly stained glass to filter the light from above, bathing the interiors in a kaleidoscope of color. Then, almost immediately, he wanted it taller. Then he wanted it taller still. The initial cost estimate of $5 million escalated dramatically, spiraling to a final, staggering figure of $13.5 million. Goldman Sachs, a leading financial institution, famously refused to finance the audacious project, deeming it too risky. Frank, undeterred and supremely confident, paid for every single aspect of the monumental undertaking himself. In cash. There was no mortgage, no restrictive bonds, and crucially, no outside investors wielding leverage over the design or its ultimate vision. It was unequivocally his building, and he intended it to function as the single largest, most unmistakable advertisement in the entire world. Every single person who gazed upon the iconic New York skyline would, from that moment forward, see his name, etched in steel and stone. But for Woolworth, a monument was useless unless it functioned with the same ruthless efficiency as one of his stores. He was also, however, equally determined to turn a profit. Frank, leveraging his entrepreneurial acumen, personally marketed the office space, charging a minimum of $4 per square foot and meticulously emphasizing the building's cutting-edge safety features to prospective, often nervous, tenants. He even arranged a dramatic demonstration to assuage any lingering fears. A raw egg was carefully placed in one of the building's elevators, 700 feet up. The cable was then deliberately cut. The innovative pneumatic brakes engaged flawlessly, and the car glided smoothly to a complete stop without so much as cracking the delicate shell. Tenants, reassured and impressed, eagerly signed leases. Within mere weeks of its grand opening, the building was already generating substantial income. The grand opening itself took place on April 24, 1913, an event of national significance. President Woodrow Wilson, seated majestically in the White House, pressed a telegraph button at the appointed hour. Simultaneously, 80,000 incandescent bulbs flared to life, firing in unison, illuminating the soaring tower from its base to its crown in a blinding cascade of light. The effect, seen from across the shimmering East River and from ships sailing in the bustling harbor, was eloquently described by Scientific American as a great crystal of flaming light. The Reverend S. Parks Cadman, standing awestruck in the building's magnificent lobby, gazed upward at the cavernous barrel-vaulted ceiling, adorned with its glittering Byzantine mosaics, and declared it, with profound reverence, the Cathedral of Commerce. Cass Gilbert, with a touch of playful irony, had sculpted subtle caricatures onto the ceiling beams of the entrance hall. One of them, a knowing wink to the man who made it all possible, depicted Frank Woolworth himself, hunched over a towering pile of coins, diligently counting his nickels, a poignant, enduring testament to his humble beginnings and the staggering fortune he had amassed, coin by humble coin. Another showed Gilbert himself, beaming with a quiet pride, gently cradling a small, perfectly rendered model of the building in his arms. Frank, it was said, considered these personal touches his most cherished features in the entire structure, far more valuable than the soaring height or the intricate stonework. The man who had once been ridiculed for paying his meager bills in loose change now literally presided over the highest occupied point on earth, and in a profound twist of fate, he had paid for it in precisely the same manner, coin by humble coin, each nickel and dime a testament to his relentless ascent. The Woolworth building held its towering title for a remarkable 16 years, a testament to its groundbreaking design and construction. Then, in 1929, the nearby 40 Wall Street, a new challenger in the sky, briefly edged past it in a furious race for altitude. Within months, the Art Deco majesty of the Chrysler Building would claim the ultimate crown. But by then, the Woolworth building had already secured something that sheer, raw height could never guarantee. It had etched itself into the very soul of the city, irrevocably becoming a landmark. It wasn't merely because it was tall. It was because Cass Gilbert and Frank Woolworth had imbued it with a distinctive, unforgettable face, a character that resonated with the populace. The magnificent Gothic spire, piercing the sky above Broadway, transformed into a fixed, immutable point in New York City's ever-evolving identity, as permanent and recognizable as the bridges spanning its waterways or the sprawling park nestled below. Frank, in his moments of grand reflection, referred to his private office inside the tower as his imperial capital. The choice of words was far from accidental. The nickels and dimes, once scorned, had not merely built a business. They had forged an empire, and now they had constructed its magnificent throne room. He sat there, high above the bustling ground, a private citizen elevated higher than any other on the planet, meticulously directing a vast chain of over 1,000 locations from a desk surrounded by the gleaming opulence of polished marble and shimmering gold leaf. Yet the panoramic view from that exalted floor could not, extend to the inner rooms of his own palatial house, where, tragically, the very foundations of his personal life were beginning to crumble. But the empire Frank built on the street was a stark contrast to the hollow dynasty he attempted to maintain at home. By 1910, Frank Woolworth had arranged his family with the same cold precision he applied to his store windows. On a single prestigious block of Fifth Avenue, he occupied a sprawling mansion across from the Metropolitan Museum, having purchased equally lavish townhouses for his 3 daughters nearby. To the public, it was a tableau of success. In reality, these were gilded boxes occupied by women who rarely saw their father. Helena, the eldest, navigated this wealth through elegant conformity. Jessie, the youngest, rebelled by marrying a man whose fortune came from a fat-rendering factory, a vulgar source that appalled Frank's high society pretensions. But it was Edna, the middle daughter, who would become the family's greatest tragedy. Edna married Franklin Law Hutton, a dashing financier whose profligate lifestyle and brazen infidelities were whispered about in every corner of New York. As her marriage unraveled, Edna sought her father's intervention. But Frank, consumed by the construction of Winfield Hall and the demands of his empire, had little room for emotional travails. He was buying his daughter's silence with gold, unaware they were drowning in the luxury he provided. It was the ultimate architect's paradox. Frank could engineer a global system to serve millions of strangers with flawless efficiency, yet he could not build a single bridge of connection to his own children. He was becoming a king who ruled over an empire of nickels, only to find himself a stranger in a house built by his own success. The collapse began in May 1917. Edna was found dead in her apartment at the Plaza Hotel at just 33 years old. While official records cited an ear infection, rumors of suicide swirled. Her 4-year-old daughter, Barbara, was the one to find the body. Frank was hosting a lavish party at Winfield Hall when the call came. Legend has it that at that exact moment, a crack appeared in the marble family crest above the fireplace, running directly through Edna's face. Whether a geological fluke or an omen, the mark remained, a jagged scar on the face of a dynasty. Frank never recovered. He had built an empire on the principle that every problem had a solution, but death was the one variable he could not control. He returned to Winfield Hall, which now felt less like a palace and more like a crypt. Winfield Hall itself was a monument to this retreating sanity. After the original house burned down in 1916, under circumstances some found suspiciously convenient, Frank replaced it with a 56-room Italian Renaissance fortress, clad entirely in impervious marble. Costing $9 million, it featured a $2 million grand staircase and ceilings trimmed in 24-karat gold. But the house's soul was found in its esoteric library, filled not with classics, but with texts on Egyptian occultism and ceremonial magic. Identifying psychologically with Napoleon Bonaparte, Frank filled the house with sphinxes and scarabs. Most unsettling were the carvings of his own mustachioed face staring down from the ceilings, an omnipresent, godlike gaze. The heart of the mansion was a fanatical replica of Napoleon's bedroom at Malmaison, where Frank would sit for hours in the emperor's chair, often wearing elaborate military uniforms. In a chilling contrast, while his mistress occupied the Empress Josephine room, his ailing wife, Jenny, was relegated to a stark, unadorned room at the farthest end of the house. By 1916, Jenny's grasp on reality had slipped entirely. She sat alone behind a door that rarely opened, recognizing nothing of the imperial fantasy built from the nickels and dimes of the poor. As Frank's mental state fractured, his professional world faced a subtle coup. He had promoted Hubert Templeton Parson to general manager, treating him like the son he never had. But Parson began a psychological war of mimicry, building a mansion larger than Frank's and buying newer cars with more staff. Frank, increasingly reclusive, did not fire him. Instead, he withdrew further into his Napoleonic fantasies. His health failed in tandem with his mind. Suffering from chronic digestive issues, his ultimate downfall was an irrational, lifelong phobia. He was terrified of dentists. By 1918, his teeth were festering sores, yet he recoiled in terror at the sight of any medical instrument. On April 5, 1919, the infection reached his bloodstream. Sepsis overwhelmed his weakened frame, and the titan of the five and dime died at Winfield Hall just days before his 67th birthday. His rival, Sebastian Kresge, closed every one of his stores in respect for the master. But the final irony was found in Frank's desk. He had meticulously drafted a new will to equitably distribute his $76 million estate, but he had never signed it. The courts were forced to revert to a will from 1889, written when Frank was a struggling retailer. It left everything to Jenny, a woman who could no longer recognize her own name. His life's work passed to a committee, which included the predatory Hubert Parson. When Jenny died 5 years later, the fortune was divided into thirds. The final portion went to Edna's daughter, Barbara. At age 11, the girl discovered by her mother's side in the Plaza Hotel became one of the wealthiest people on earth. Winfield Hall remained, a haunting monument. In the decades that followed, it became a modeling school for stewardesses and a frequent Hollywood set, but the rumors of the House of Horrors persisted. Students reported hearing a woman weeping in the locked Marie Antoinette room, believed to be Edna's ghost. The empire Frank W. Woolworth built on the backs of pennies had created the world's tallest building and a legendary fortune, but it left behind a family haunted by loss and a palace that was ultimately just a very expensive tomb. The nickels and dimes Frank W. Woolworth had spent a lifetime accumulating were now a mountain of gold, resting entirely on the fragile shoulders of an orphaned girl. A staggering $26 million, a sum unimaginable to most, arrived in Barbara Hutton's young life before she had any inkling of what to truly do with it, or what it would demand of her. She was just 11 years old when her grandmother Jenny died, and the monumental Woolworth fortune was, with a chilling formality, carved into thirds. Her substantial share, held in a carefully managed trust, instantly made her one of the wealthiest children on the entire planet. Yet it did not, in any meaningful way, make her feel any less alone. After the tragic and scandalous death of her mother at the Plaza Hotel, young Barbara had been unceremoniously passed between various relatives, shifted from one grand house to another, much like an unwanted heirloom, a beautiful but burdensome object. Her father, Franklin Hutton, an indifferent and often absent parent, but an undeniably gifted investor, first moved her to the sunnier climes of San Francisco, then back to the bustling metropolis of New York, and subsequently shuffled her through a series of elite boarding schools in Connecticut and Manhattan. He was, by most accounts, emotionally detached, but remarkably shrewd. He managed Barbara's trust with such exceptional skill that when the devastating Wall Street crash of 1929 wiped out much of the wider Woolworth family's wealth, Barbara's individual portion actually grew, a testament to his financial acumen. She entered adulthood not just wealthy, but richer than her legendary grandfather had been even at the absolute height of his imperial power. The public, however, truly met Barbara Hutton in 1930, during the grim depths of the Great Depression, when her family, in an astonishing display of extravagance, staged a lavish debutante ball at the opulent Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The affair reportedly cost more than $60,000, a sum that, in that era of widespread suffering, was nothing short of scandalous. Bread lines stretched for blocks through lower Manhattan, and the newspapers, reflecting the public's outrage and envy, were not kind. The headlines, with cruel efficiency, christened her the poor little rich girl, a name that would, like an inescapable shadow, follow her for the rest of her tumultuous life, a label she would never truly manage to outrun. She married for the first time at the tender age of 20. His name was Alexis Medivani, a self-styled Georgian prince whose royal credentials were, at best, entirely decorative, and at worst, a complete fabrication. The marriage, a whirlwind of infatuation and extravagance, lasted a mere 2 years. Barbara later confessed that she had realized almost immediately that Mundavani was far more interested in the vast sums residing in her bank account than in her actual company or affection. The subsequent divorce settlement, a costly lesson in human nature, set her back somewhere between $2 and $3 million, depending on which lawyer was keeping count. Her second husband, Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow, was a Danish aristocrat with a considerably longer name and a notoriously shorter temper. They married in 1935, a union marked by turbulence and increasingly public acrimony. Their son, Lance, the only child Barbara would ever have, was born the following year, a brief moment of hope in a stormy marriage that collapsed irrevocably not long afterward. Barbara, fiercely protective of her son, fought a bitter, protracted custody battle that spanned multiple countries and continents, and the voracious press, ever eager for scandal, meticulously covered every single hearing, turning her private anguish into public spectacle. The third marriage, perhaps inevitably, was the one the world collectively remembers, etched into the annals of Hollywood lore. In 1942, in the midst of World War II, Barbara Hutton married the legendary actor Cary Grant. On paper, they were undoubtedly the most glamorous, iconic couple in America. He was the biggest, most debonair movie star of the era, the epitome of charm and sophistication. She was, by all accounts, the richest woman most people had ever even heard of, a walking embodiment of limitless wealth. The tabloids, with their characteristic flair for catchy nicknames, instantly dubbed them Cash and Carrie, a moniker that perfectly encapsulated their disparate appeals. The marriage, despite its dazzling facade, lasted a mere 3 years. Notably, Grant was the only one of her 7 husbands who, with an integrity that stood in stark contrast to the others, resolutely refused alimony, walking away from her immense fortune with his dignity intact. There would be 4 more husbands after him, each a variation on a theme: another prince, a worldly diplomat, a European baron, and yet another prince. Each successive marriage, tragically, followed an almost identical self-destructive pattern that Barbara seemed utterly unable to break. An initial whirlwind of infatuation, followed by lavish, increasingly extravagant spending, then the slow, painful creep of disillusionment, and finally, the inevitable, bitter separation. She gave lavishly, almost compulsively, to each husband, funding their opulent lifestyles, absorbing their burgeoning debts, and in doing so, she emerged from each successive divorce increasingly diminished, both in fortune and, more tragically, in self-confidence. Money became the only language Barbara knew how to speak, using it both as a shield against the world and a desperate gift to buy a fleeting sense of belonging. Between marriages, a restless, unmoored existence, she moved incessantly between luxurious hotels in the glittering capitals of Paris, London, Tangier, and New York. She was never truly settling down, rarely alone for long, and seemingly never quite able to articulate what, precisely, she was so desperately searching for. Her closest, most enduring companion through much of this peripatetic existence was her cousin, Jimmy Donahue, Jessie's younger son. Jimmy, who had inherited his own substantial portion of the Woolworth estate, had, with equal enthusiasm and recklessness, burned through it with a similar disregard for its permanence. He was charming, wildly reckless, and tragically plagued by a constellation of addictions that would eventually consume him entirely. He and Barbara, 2 gilded souls adrift in a sea of inherited wealth, understood each other with a profound, almost symbiotic empathy, the way that only 2 people raised inside the same specific kind of wreckage, the same gilded cage, truly can. Barbara was, despite her personal struggles, capable of extraordinary, spontaneous generosity. During the dark years of the Second World War, she selflessly donated her magnificent London mansion, Winfield House, to the United States government for use as the official residence of the American ambassador to the Court of St. James's, a gift valued in the millions. She funded hospitals, established schools, and initiated vital relief programs in numerous countries she had visited, her philanthropic impulses often surprising even her own jaded advisors. She even, in acts of spontaneous kindness, gave money to complete strangers who showed her genuine warmth or consideration, sometimes in amounts that startled even her most experienced financial counselors. But the spending, the incessant, almost compulsive spending, never truly stopped. And even a fortune as vast as the Woolworth inheritance was, crucially, not infinite. By the early 1970s, Barbara was living on a rapidly diminishing trust fund, forced to sell off precious jewelry and valuable properties simply to cover her extravagant expenses, and relying increasingly on the fleeting, conditional attention of people whose interest in her was, regrettably, contingent solely on her ability to pay for dinner or finance their latest whim. Then, on the somber day of July 24, 1972, her beloved son, Lance, was tragically killed. He had been a passenger in a small Cessna aircraft, scouting property near his home in Aspen, Colorado, when an inexperienced pilot, caught in a violent thunderstorm, flew directly into a blind canyon. Lance, a vibrant, accomplished man, was just 36 years old. He had, in the 1960s, built a highly successful motor racing team, even designing an innovative car called the Scarab that had famously beaten formidable Ferraris on American circuits. He was, by the unanimous accounts of those who knew him well, one of the few genuinely stable, grounded people in Barbara's tumultuous life, a steady anchor in her chaotic world. His senseless death, more than any marriage or financial loss, finally broke something fundamental within Barbara that the previous heartbreaks and the corrupting influence of the money had only managed to bend. Barbara Hutton spent her final, increasingly frail years at the luxurious Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, a recluse in her own golden cage. She was largely confined to her opulent suite, attended by a small, dedicated circle of staff and companions. She died there on May 11, 1979, at the age of 66. One biographer, with a stark finality, wrote that, at the time of her death, a mere $3,500 was all that remained of the once unfathomable Woolworth fortune. Others close to her disputed the precise figure, but no one, absolutely no one, disputed the tragic trajectory. The girl who had inherited $26 million at the tender age of 11 had, with an almost desperate compulsion, spent nearly all of it, a lifetime's fortune, searching for something the money could never, ever buy. She was interred, finally at peace, beside her mother and her grandparents in the ornate Woolworth vault at Woodlawn Cemetery, joining the family from which her extraordinary, yet ultimately tragic, story had sprung. While the American branches enjoyed relative peace and prosperity during the early 1940s, the British division was abruptly thrust onto the devastating front lines of World War II. In a remarkable display of patriotism in 1940, Woolworth's British staff rallied together, raising over 200,000 sixpences from their own pockets to buy Spitfire fighter planes for the Royal Air Force, proudly naming them Nix over 6. But this heroic defiance came at a horrific cost, as the beloved stores themselves became battlegrounds. Out of 767 British branches, 326 were badly damaged and 26 were completely destroyed by enemy bombing. The most devastating blow struck on November 25, 1944, when a German Vi-2 rocket plummeted into the Woolworths store in New Cross, London. In a blinding instant, 168 people, shoppers and staff alike, were killed in what became the worst civilian casualty incident from any enemy action during the entire conflict. It was a heartbreaking tragedy that proved the five and dime had become an inseparable, bleeding part of the communities it served. While the personal fortune of the Woolworths was dissolving into private tragedies, the red-fronted stores themselves were becoming the front lines of a public revolution. On the quiet afternoon of February 1, 1960, a date that would forever be etched into the annals of American history, 4 determined freshmen from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University walked with a purpose into the F.W. Woolworth store located at 132 South Elm Street in Greensboro, North Carolina. Their names were Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond. They were just 18 and 19 years old, young men on the cusp of adulthood, but already carrying the weight of generations of injustice. They had been meticulously planning this moment since Christmas, their resolve solidified by an incident in which McNeil had been indignantly refused a hot dog at the Greyhound bus station in town, simply because of the color of his skin. That seemingly minor refusal had been the unbearable last in a long, humiliating series of refusals, of slights, of daily indignities that had accumulated over their young lives, and it was the one, finally, that had galvanized them to decide that it was time to act, to push back. They entered the bustling store, outwardly appearing to be ordinary customers, and proceeded to purchase toothpaste at the main sales counter, receiving a receipt for their transaction. This receipt, a small piece of paper, would become a crucial prop in their planned defiance. With the purchased item in hand, they then walked deliberately, their footsteps firm, to the 66-seat lunch counter situated conspicuously at the back of the store. And there, with quiet determination, they sat down. The sign above the counter, an insidious symbol of the Jim Crow South, explicitly stated that it was for white customers only. Black customers, they knew well, were permitted to buy merchandise anywhere else in the store, to browse the aisles, but they were strictly forbidden from sitting at that counter. They could not order a simple cup of coffee. They could not eat a donut from a plate, served to them like any other human being. The four freshmen knew these humiliating rules intimately, understood the rigid boundaries of segregation. Yet, they sat down anyway. A white waitress, her expression a mixture of surprise and ingrained prejudice, immediately approached them and curtly informed them that the counter did not serve Negroes. Blair, with a calm, irrefutable logic, replied that he had, in fact, just been served 2 feet away at the general merchandise counter, highlighting the blatant absurdity of the store's discriminatory policy. The waitress, however, stubbornly repeated the entrenched policy, her words ringing with the weight of generations of racial division. The students did not move. Their presence, quiet but unyielding, became a silent challenge. The store manager, Clarence Harris, was quickly summoned, his face a mask of concern. He sternly asked them to leave the premises, to conform to the established order. They stayed, their resolve unbroken. Soon, uniformed police officers arrived, dispatched to handle what was, in the eyes of many, an audacious breach of social etiquette. They looked at the 4 young men, sitting quietly and orderly on their stools, their receipt held visibly in hand, and, after a brief consultation, they determined that, technically, no law had been broken. There was, to their consternation, nothing they could legally do to force them to leave. The 4 courageous students remained seated, unwavering, until the store finally closed its doors that evening. They then walked back to campus, their mission accomplished, their quiet act of defiance a seed planted. The very next morning they returned, but this time, they were not alone. They were accompanied by 20 more students, all ready to join the burgeoning protest, a ripple of change growing into a wave. The following day, the modest group of 20-plus students swelled to over 60, their presence a quiet, unyielding force against the lunch counter's pristine white surface. By February 5th, a mere 5 days after the initial spark, the protest had exploded. More than 300 determined demonstrators, a vibrant mosaic of young faces, packed the Greensboro Woolworths, their sheer numbers spilling out onto the sidewalk, creating an undeniable spectacle. The air thrummed with a palpable sense of purpose, a silent but powerful declaration of defiance that resonated far beyond the store's plate glass windows. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. Within a week, the Greensboro sit-ins had captivated the national press, their story emblazoned across front pages and echoing through radio waves. Inspired by the courageous stand of these North Carolina A&T students, similar sit-ins erupted like brushfires across the segregated South: Winston-Salem, Durham, Raleigh, Nashville, each city echoing the call for equality. It was a testament to the powerful idea that had been sparked. Ordinary young people refusing to wait for change, creating it themselves. Incredibly, within just 3 months, the movement had metastasized, igniting lunch counter sit-ins in 55 cities across 13 states. All organized by students who, after reading about Greensboro in their morning papers, decided that waiting was no longer an option. While not the very first sit-in of the civil rights movement, as similar protests had occurred at the Alexandria Library in 1939 or at Dockham Drug Store in 1958, the Greensboro sit-in was the catalyst that changed the nation. Organized independently by 4 courageous college freshmen, This localized protest at a Woolworth lunch counter ignited a nationwide movement, directly leading to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Meanwhile, back at the corporate headquarters in New York, the F.W. Woolworth Company found itself in a state of bewildered paralysis. Its response to the escalating crisis was slow, confused, and increasingly costly. Corporate leadership, seemingly detached from the moral and social earthquake rumbling through their southern stores, abdicated responsibility, leaving the weighty decisions and the growing financial liabilities to individual store managers. Clarence Harris, the Greensboro store manager, was caught in an impossible bind, trapped between the corporate indifference from above and the relentless, ever-growing tide of protest below. He tried everything. He shut down the lunch counter for stretches, hoping to outlast the students, to break their spirit through sheer inconvenience. But it was a futile endeavor. It did not work. The students and their allies were relentless. A comprehensive boycott, meticulously organized and powerfully enforced, gutted his sales. The once bustling aisles of Woolworths grew quiet, the cash registers silent. By midsummer, the financial hemorrhaging at the Greensboro location had become catastrophic, with losses soaring past $200,000. Harris's own salary, a stark indicator of his failure to meet targets in the face of insurmountable pressure, was cut. The economic leverage of the movement was undeniable, forcing corporate America to confront the consequences of its discriminatory policies. Finally, on July 25, 1960, a quiet surrender. Clarence Harris gave in. There were no triumphant public announcements, no press conferences heralded with fanfare. The victory, momentous as it was, unfolded with a profound, almost intimate dignity. Harris simply asked 4 of his own black employees, Geneva Tisdale, Susie Morrison, Antha Jones, and Charles Bess, to perform an extraordinary act. They were to remove their work uniforms, shed their aprons, and for the first time in their lives, sit down at the lunch counter not as servers, but as customers. With a quiet grace, they ordered. They were served. They ate. The simple, revolutionary act of consuming a meal at a counter that had for so long denied them that right marked the beginning of integration. The desegregation of Woolworth's lunch counters, a pivotal moment in American history, began not with a handshake between powerful executives or a pronouncement from on high, but with 4 courageous employees, in their street clothes, sitting down to eat. It was a stark, poignant realization of a principle Frank W. Woolworth himself had championed, yet his company had tragically abandoned. He had built his vast retail empire on the seemingly simple yet revolutionary idea that price should be fixed, access should be open to all, and no customer should ever feel unwelcome. 60 years after his death, the very company that bore his name had to be forcibly reminded, compelled by the unwavering moral conviction of 4 teenagers armed with little more than a tube of toothpaste and a receipt, to live up to that foundational principle. The Greensboro sit-in movement, a testament to grassroots activism, became a catalyst, accelerating the desegregation of public accommodations across the entire American South and carving its indelible place as one of the defining, most impactful actions of the American civil rights movement. Yet, the victory in Greensboro was just the first domino to fall. The Woolworth lunch counter, a beloved American institution since the first one opened in New Albany, New York in 1923, had officially become a national battleground. In 1963, at a Woolworths in Jackson, Mississippi, a sit-in by Tougaloo College students was met by a violent white mob that physically assaulted the peaceful protesters, pouring hot coffee, ketchup, and sugar over their heads. That same summer in St. Augustine, Florida, 16 young people were arrested for simply ordering a hamburger and a Coke at Woolworths. 4 of these teenagers refused a judge's plea deal that would have permanently stripped their right to protest. They endured 77 days in jail and a brutal reform school, becoming known nationwide as the St. Augustine Four. It took the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to finally force the integration of every remaining Woolworths in the country. Today, almost all of these historic counters are gone, with the exception of one perfectly preserved, fully operational Woolworths diner hidden inside an antique mall in Bakersfield, California. It stands as a nostalgic relic of a bygone retail era, but also a quiet monument to the ordinary people who sat down and changed history. The Greensboro Woolworth store, now a symbol of both resistance and progress, continued to serve all customers at its lunch counter for another 3 decades. When the store finally closed its doors in 1993, a significant piece of its history, a section of that iconic lunch counter, was carefully preserved and donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, where it stands as a silent testament to a transformative era. The building itself was reborn, becoming the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, ensuring that its powerful story would continue to educate and inspire future generations. And in a remarkable echo of history, Geneva Tisdale, one of the 4 employees who had been asked to sit down on that momentous July morning in 1960, was still working at the store the day it closed. She had been there on February 1, 1960, witnessing the initial daring act of the students. She was there on July 25th, when she became one of the first black customers served at that very counter. And she was there on the last day, 33 years later, when the doors of the Greensboro Woolworths shut for good, a living bridge across a chasm of monumental change. Social change was not the only force threatening the established order. A new generation of retail giants was rising to challenge the empire's very foundation. The companies that ultimately eclipsed and dismantled the Woolworth chain did not invent anything fundamentally new. Instead, they recognized the enduring power of Frank W. Woolworth's original groundbreaking ideas. Fixed prices, open displays that encourage self-service, high-volume sales driven by thin margins, and direct purchasing from manufacturers to cut costs. The new titans of retail simply executed these principles on a grander, more aggressive, and more technologically advanced scale than Woolworth's successors ever managed. Kmart, a burgeoning discount department store, opened its first location in 1962, followed closely by Walmart, which debuted in Rogers, Arkansas, that same year. Target soon joined the fray, opening its doors in Roseville, Minnesota. All 3 understood, just as Woolworth had intuitively grasped in 1879, that ordinary people would buy more, much more, if prices were irresistibly low and the shopping experience was convenient and accessible. But while Woolworth's company had grown cautious, slow, and resistant to change, these new competitors were nimble, aggressive, and incredibly fast. They built sprawling, larger stores, strategically moved into the rapidly expanding suburbs to capture a new demographic, and invested heavily in cutting-edge logistics, computing power, and sophisticated supply chain management at a pace that left the venerable old 5 and 10 model far behind. Woolworth's downfall was a classic tale of the innovator's dilemma. The very company that had once destroyed traditional dry goods stores by being radical was now being dismantled by its own success. They had forgotten that in retail, heritage is a liability if it anchors you to a dying model, while their competitors treated the past as a ghost to be outrun. For a time, the sheer scale of the F.W. Woolworth Company still masked its internal vulnerabilities. At its 100th anniversary in 1979, the company proudly held the distinction of being the largest department store chain in the world, operating an astounding 8,000 stores globally by 1982. But this impressive scale was deeply misleading, an illusion of enduring strength. Beneath the surface, the stores were aging, their infrastructure creaking, and their merchandise felt increasingly dated, failing to capture the imagination of a new generation of shoppers. The iconic lunch counters, once vibrant social centers of small-town life, were rapidly losing customers to the burgeoning fast food chains that offered speed and novelty. But outdated merchandise and empty lunch counters were the least of their problems. The tragic reality of this aging, neglected infrastructure was exposed to the world in the most horrifying way possible. In May 1979, during the very year the company was celebrating its 100th anniversary, a massive fire engulfed a major Woolworths branch in central Manchester, England. Broadcast live on national television, the devastating inferno claimed the lives of 9 people, 8 shoppers, and 1 employee. The subsequent public inquiry sparked national outrage when it revealed fatal management flaws. Emergency exits had been locked, and the staff lacked even basic fire safety training. This catastrophic event dealt a severe blow to the Woolworth brand's reputation, proving that the empire's internal management was crumbling just as fast as its buildings, and directly forcing sweeping changes to fire safety regulations across the entire retail industry. Faced with the rise of modern supermarkets and suburban malls, Woolworth realized the traditional five-and-dime model was no longer enough. To survive, the empire embarked on an aggressive diversification strategy, snapping up specialized retail chains. In North America, the shopping spree began early with the acquisition of the Kinney Shoe Corporation in 1963, a fateful move that would later spawn Foot Locker and the Richmond Brothers fashion chain in 1969. Throughout the 80s and 90s, they aggressively expanded into shopping malls with brands like Kidsmart, Champ Sports, and Afterthoughts. Meanwhile, the British division executed its own massive pivot. In 1980, they acquired the DIY superstore chain B&Q, later adding the Comet Electrical chain and Superdrug drugstore, ultimately transforming the UK branch into the highly successful retail giant, Kingfisher plc. However, this rapid diversification was a double-edged sword. While these new specialty stores flourished, the original variety stores were cannibalized and neglected. The financial bleeding forced the company to sell 120 of its Canadian Woolco stores to a rising competitor named Walmart in 1994, signaling the beginning of the end for the traditional Woolworth brand. Meanwhile, Foot Locker, with its clear focus and keen understanding of emerging consumer trends, grew steadily, propelled by the explosive, insatiable consumer demand for branded athletic shoes. A cultural shift was underway, and sneakers were rapidly transcending their utilitarian purpose to become potent symbols of identity and fashion. By the mid-1990s, the transformation was complete and irreversible. Foot Locker and its constellation of related athletic brands had become the undisputed dominant source of the company's profits. The dwindling number of variety stores that still bravely carried the Woolworth name were, by this point, hemorrhaging money. The original dream was dying. On July 17, 1997, a poignant and symbolic date, the last Woolworth stores in the United States closed their doors for good, marking the end of an American retail icon. That same year, a profound generational and economic shift was underscored when Walmart, the very embodiment of the new retail paradigm, was added to the prestigious Dow Jones Industrial Average, taking the very spot that had for so long belonged to Woolworth. It's a common misconception that Woolworth was simply bought out by another shoe company. In reality, Foot Locker is the legal continuation of the original F.W. Woolworth Company. After closing its variety stores in 1997, the corporation shifted focus entirely to its most profitable division, sporting goods, eventually renaming itself Venator Group, and later Foot Locker, incorporated in 2001. The last corporate trace of the Woolworth name had seemingly been erased from the company Frank W. Woolworth had so meticulously built. The story of this retail lineage took its final dramatic turn in September 2025, when Dick's Sporting Goods officially acquired Foot Locker in a massive $2.5 billion deal. Determined to revitalize the struggling brand, Dick's appointed former Nike executive Ann Freeman as the new president of Foot Locker North America. Under the leadership of Executive Chairman Ed Stack, the new parent company immediately launched a ruthless turnaround strategy dubbed Fast Break. This aggressive move involved cleaning out the garage, taking a massive $500 million to $750 million pre-tax charge to liquidate unproductive inventory and clear out 30% of underperforming shoe styles from their walls. By stripping away the dead weight, Dick's aims to resurrect the Foot Locker brand to its former glory by the 2026 back-to-school season. It is a bold, multi-billion-dollar gamble to save the last surviving heir of Frank Woolworth's original American empire. While the American stores faded away, the drama overseas was just reaching its climax. The British subsidiary, once the crown jewel that generated half of the empire's profits, met a spectacularly catastrophic end. By late 2008, crippled by massive debt and the global credit crunch, Woolworths Group plc went into administration. In a breathtakingly brutal span of just 41 days, over 800 British stores were shuttered forever, wiping out 30,000 jobs and erasing a century-old high street institution overnight. Yet from the ashes of this European collapse came a shocking plot twist in Germany. The German Woolworth branch also faced insolvency during the 2009 financial crisis. But instead of dying, it orchestrated a miraculous resurrection. Staying true to Frank Woolworth's original ultra-low-cost vision, the German entity restructured and expanded aggressively, growing to over 600 thriving stores. In a poetic twist of retail fate, in 2024, this highly profitable German descendant actually bought the rights to the British Woolworths brand, plotting to bring the legendary name back to the UK. But the strange legacy of the Woolworth name was not confined to survival or bankruptcy. In some corners of the globe, the brand was simply stolen. Perhaps the most fascinating testament to the sheer power of the Woolworth name isn't found in America or Europe, but in the Southern Hemisphere, where the brand was legally hijacked. By the 1920s, the Woolworth brand was so globally revered that a group of savvy Australian entrepreneurs, led by H.G. Christmas, realized something astonishing. Frank Woolworth had never trademarked his name down under. In 1924, they cheekily registered F.W. Woolworth and Company Limited simply to cash in on the brand's immense prestige. By the time the American and British executives stopped their internal infighting long enough to notice, it was too late to stop them. Today, Woolworths Group is the largest supermarket chain in Australia, and a completely separate upmarket retail chain called Woolworths dominates South Africa. Ironically, neither of these modern retail giants has ever had any legal or financial connection to Frank Winfield Woolworth's original empire. Yet, the core concept that Frank W. Woolworth pioneered, a store where everything costs a fixed, remarkably low price, lives on vibrantly in the dollar stores that now number in the tens of thousands across the United States. In everything but name, they are his direct, thriving descendants. The magnificent Woolworth building still stands proudly at 233 Broadway in New York City, its ornate lobby perfectly intact. The whimsical caricatures of Frank W. Woolworth and his architect Cass Gilbert still face each other from opposite corners, frozen in time. The tower is residential now, its upper floors converted into luxurious apartments, a symbol of urban reinvention. Nobody works for the Woolworth Company there anymore. Nobody has since 1999. The Woolworth Empire proves that a legacy is rarely found in steel or stone. The Cathedral of Commerce may now be a playground for the elite, and the family name may be hijacked on distant shores, but Frank's ghost lives on in every price tag we read and every aisle we walk. He taught the world how to want, how to buy, and ultimately, how easily a fortune built on pennies can slip through the fingers of those who forget that people, not profits, are the only true foundation of an empire.